So it does seem like we have a good amount of people on right now. First and foremost, I'd like to thank each and every single one of you for coming out here today and giving us your time to support us in our mission to empower young women, especially young women of color, into into these fields of studies. Uh, I can attest, I can speak for myself and I can speak for the rest of the co-founders when I say that so many months back when I had first mentioned the idea of possibly doing a women of color empowerment event, none of us thought that this event would blow up into the way it has. And we are so, so grateful for each and every single one of you who has came out here today and has supported us in our mission. With that being said, I'd like to give a very, very special shout out to the outreach team who has made this event possible, and to our co-hosts, Christina and Lauren, who have been so kind to volunteer their time. So with that being said, would you two like to take the floor?
Hello, everyone. My name is Lauren Watts, and I'm a member of the journalism team at YCACW. Today, we have a wonderful guest speaker who will be talking about her lengthy career as a professor of law and Chancellor social justice scholar at Rutgers Law School, and her many awards and achievements. She's written over 30 academic articles and book chapters, along with a book titled Racial Muslim: When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. She's the founding director for Race, Security, and Rights at Rutgers University, and mainly prioritized the intersection of national security and civil rights, with emphasis on the post 9/11 era in her work. Without further ado, everyone please welcome Professor Sahar Aziz.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much to the brilliant young ladies who have invited me today to speak, and to your youth coalition. I know you focus on many social justice issues, including the very real and high priority concern of climate change. Those who are living in Texas have just lived through one example of extreme weather that it was unprecedented, and it'll be interesting to hear the scientists' explanations as to whether that is a result of climate change. So I'm very honored and pleased to be here today in front of all of these young people. I only wish we could do this in person, but in some ways technology brings us all together in ways we probably wouldn't be able to if we were in person. So as was stated, my name is Sahar Aziz. I'm a professor of law and the Chancellor social justice scholar at Rutgers Law School. Rutgers is a remarkable law school. I got to put a plug in for my home institution. We have a campus in Newark and we have a campus in Camden. And we are very proud to have a strong social justice mission and a social justice identity, which attracts many law students because they want to pursue social justice lawyering, which I'll talk in some detail about today in my comments. But first, one small housekeeping statement or comment. If you all use Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, get your phones out now and follow the center that I founded and that I'm the director of, the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. The Twitter tag is RUCSRR. The Instagram tag is Rutgers CSRR, and facebook.com/RUCSRR. And I'm only stating that because a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is we educate and talk about these issues on a daily basis through our social media platforms. Okay, so first let me tell you a little bit about myself and how I got to this very privileged position of being a tenured professor at one of the best law schools in the country. And I am not someone that is supposed to be where I am, because there were many, and there are many obstacles in the way of people with my life story, right? But one of the benefits or one of the advantages that one attains, and one of the skills one attains when they are a member of the underdog, right? The underprivileged or the underrepresented, is resilience and grit and persistence and tenacity. And that's something that you acquire as a survival tool, right? And so I hope that all of you are always strengthening those skills within yourselves, because you can't change the world for the better overnight, and it's not easy, and it's not going to happen with a magic wand. It's going to happen with hard work, tenacity, grit, persistence, and focus, right? right? So that's just the game. That's part of the endeavor that you will enter if you want to be a change agent, if you want to be a reformer, which all of us should always be reformers because things can always be better, right? That's what makes America unique in many ways. It's a very dynamic place, a dynamic society where we value change and evolution in our economy and our political system and our society, as opposed to stagnance and retrenchment. So I am an immigrant. I'm actually, yeah, I'm an immigrant. I'm not a child of immigrants. I was born in Cairo, and then I came to the United States. I immigrated to the United States when I was very young. My parents obviously brought me and my siblings here. And as a result, my parents did not speak English as a first language, did not speak English at home. We spoke Arabic. We were a religious minority, we're Muslims. We didn't have a social network, right? All of their entire social network was in Egypt. Their friends, their families, their professional network, and their social network. And so to come here without that social network is a really big challenge for all immigrants, regardless whether they're wealthy or poor, although of course the wealthy immigrants can develop those social networks quickly, and the poor immigrants have to work much, much harder if they can ever attain the same level. But that is a big challenge that immigrants face, and my family was no exception. We also came with very little money, which is the common story. Most people who immigrate to the United States, and this is an immigrant society, the only people who have the right to be here without having to either settle or colonize or oppress or get a visa through a settler colonial system. We have to be honest about the way that this country was formed, or being forcibly brought here, right, as slaves, primarily from Africa, or the Native Americans. Right? So all of us are immigrants or descendants of slaves or Native Americans. And when you look at the immigrant population, regardless of where they came from in the world, and there are waves throughout American history, they had a few things in common. And one of them is they usually were struggling in some way in their home country. It could have been from political strife. It could have been from economic deprivation. Now I think we're going to start seeing a lot of climate refugees. We're already starting to see that. So that will be another hardship that will push people out of their homelands to other foreign lands. But economics is a big driver, and my family was one of those people. And so as a result, most immigrants come here with minimal resources, right? Because if they were comfortable economically, and if they were comfortable politically, and if everything was fine, they'd stay home, because it's not a pleasurable experience. It's not an easy experience to leave your home, to leave your family, to leave where you're a member of the majority or where you speak the language that's your native tongue. So one of the things that we tend not to appreciate about immigrants, and this is where the xenophobia in this country that is part of this country's history, right? There was anti-Irish sentiment, there was anti-Italian sentiment, there was anti-Jewish sentiment, which was tied to being anti-Russian because many of the Jews that immigrated came from Eastern Russia. There's anti-Latino sentiment, anti-South Asian, right? The anti-immigrant, this is the paradox of the United States. It was built in large, immigrants played a huge role, in addition to African Americans, in addition to Native Americans, in building this country, but also they're despised, right? And there's all of this resentment against them, and this is a paradox. But nonetheless, many immigrants also come here, in addition to economic struggle that they tend to have at home, they also tend to come here with an enormous amount of grit and focus and willpower, because they have a mission, right? They're coming here usually to make their lives better for their children, especially economically, educationally, and also a safe place if their homelands were not safe. So all of that is to say that I'm very proud of being a success story, but the success is really not mine alone. It is my parents. I'm very grateful to my parents. They sacrificed an enormous amount for me to get to where I am, and both economically and personally. And I know that when I meet an immigrant, especially if they're an immigrant who had a similar pathway that I did, where they may have come, their families came without a lot of money, maybe without a formal college education, and had to start new. And then I see them in, for example, a professional job. I know that their parents sacrificed an enormous amount. And I know that they had to work twice and 3 times as hard as other families who didn't have those challenges. So I think we have to acknowledge that and be grateful for those who are beneficiaries of that. But one of the reasons why I became a lawyer is because of the struggles that my parents experienced. And so one thing that I encourage you is to consider law as a way to empower yourself when you see things that either harm you directly or harm the people you love directly or indirectly, or you just know that something's happening that's unjust and you want to do something about it. There are many different ways to struggle or fight for justice, but law is the path I chose, and law is the path that I encourage as many young women and minorities to choose from. For those of you who may not know, the legal profession is 86% white in America, which is not representative of the population. So we do need to diversify the legal profession. Now, more women have started to become lawyers because law schools since about 25 years ago, maybe 25 to 30 years ago, started to have gender parity where about half of the law students are women. However, not all of them stay in the profession because our society is very sexist. It doesn't provide paid leave for maternity leave. It doesn't allow women who tend to be the primary caregivers to off-ramp in their careers and then get back on after 2 or 3 or 5 years while their children are preschool. And it also expects women to be the primary caregiver such that they are the ones who sacrifice their careers in the interest of their children while their husbands or the fathers continue to work and then move up in their careers in pay and promotion. And then finally, young ladies, you have a major social justice issue that affects all of you. You on average will be paid 80 cents on the dollar as compared to your male counterparts that are similarly situated. That is a statistical fact. That is an example of raw and blatant sexism in America. So when obviously there are exceptions, but as a group, right, when you look at the data overall, regardless of the profession, now some professions, the gender disparity is not as bad, but when you take it all into account, it's 80 cents on the dollar and it's 2021. And so it's a very unfortunate fact that my female law students, no matter how hard they work, no matter what grades they get, have a high probability, if not nearly a guarantee, that they're going to get 80,000 if their male counterpart gets 100,000. And that's something we have to change, ladies. It's on us. We can't accept it. It really, to me, warrants a massive protest because it's theft. It's salary theft and wage theft, that we do the same amount of work, the same work, and we get paid 20% less. Okay, so those are the types of things that we learn when we become lawyers. Is then strategically, do we fix that through litigation? Do we fix that through advocacy? Do we fix that through public education? And being a lawyer allows you to be multifaceted, where you can learn the different ways of advocating for the interests of your client or the interests of a particular cause, depending on who you work for, right? If you work for a nonprofit or if you work and represent a particular individual organization, then that's your client. Or if you work for a company and within their general counsel, that's your client. But ultimately what we're taught is there is usually a case, a cause, an issue in which we are advocating on behalf of, right? So all that is to say that created in me my immigrant experience and the challenges that my family faced and the discrimination that we faced. We faced a lot of discrimination. And accent discrimination is a very serious one that we faced. My mother wore the hijab, so that was another form of religious discrimination that she faced. And depending on your phenotype, right, and where you live in the country, you can be raised in certain ways. I was raised in large part in Texas, so a lot of people presumed I was Latina. And so to the extent that there is anti-Latinx bias in this country, but to the extent that I was perceived as Latina, then I would be discriminated against on that grounds. And then after September 11th, when Arabs and Middle Easterners were outed because we were very invisible. We tended to, depending on what we looked like, we tended to either pass as Hispanic or biracial or white, because the Middle East is a very diverse place, and you will see people that look every color, every hair texture, every facial structure that's possible within that region, right? So after 9/11, we were certainly discriminated against overtly for being Muslim, for being Middle Eastern. And that is something that essentially led to me deciding to start the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, which focuses on the civil and human rights of Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians. But we look at how that discrimination and how those biases and those prejudices overlap with biases and prejudices and discrimination against African Americans and Native Americans and LGBTQ communities and other minority communities, because oftentimes they have the same historical roots, or they have the same dynamics, right? So a bigot against one group tends to also be a bigot against other groups. So that is one way in which I ended up founding the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. Now, I decided to become a lawyer because it quickly dawned on me that this was the avenue in the United States in which one could understand the system in order to beat the system, in order to change the system, reform the system. It's no coincidence that lawyers are overrepresented as elected officials. That is because what we teach in law school prepares them to be able to look at issues from both sides, to be able to do their due diligence, to debate, and to understand how law works and legislative processes. And it also gives leadership skills, right, that you can use not only in a courtroom or at a negotiating table or as a mediator, but also as an elected official. And I do hope many of you in the audience do run for office. I actually just ran for my first elected office position as a member of the Board of Education in my town in Westfield, New Jersey. And I'm very honored and privileged to serve in that public service role. And so I hope that you all will do the same thing, whether you want to aim for U.S. House of Representatives and Senate, or your state legislature, or local city or local school board, right? And you don't have to be a lawyer to run or to win, but those skill sets that we teach you in law school certainly assist and prepare you for those types of, especially public speaking engagements. So when I went to the University of Texas in Austin, and when I was there, I worked for the ACLU. I was the post 9/11 discrimination legal intern, because I was a first-year law student in the fall of 2001, which is when 9/11 happened. And that was when my community, which was Muslim and Arab, for those of you who don't know, the majority of Arabs are actually Christian. The minority of Arabs in the US are Muslim. But Muslims encompass all races and ethnicities, from Arab to South Pakistani, Indian, Indonesian, Malaysian, Bosnian, many Eastern Europeans, Sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa. It's a very, very diverse faith. And so anybody who was perceived to be Muslim, including some Latinos, and also those who were in fact Muslim, were being discriminated against. And that really motivated me to commit my career to social justice lawyering. So then I went to Washington, D.C. First, I clerked for a federal judge, I was very honored to have clerked for Judge Andre M. Davis, an African-American judge who then went on to serve on the Fourth Circuit, the Federal Appellate the Federal Appellate Court in the Fourth Circuit, and also then went and worked for a big law firm where I gained some very valuable experience. And ultimately, once I got those skills, I then went and practiced plaintiff's law, which is effectively suing, in my case, companies for gender discrimination in pay and promotion. Because again, as I mentioned earlier, women get paid 80 cents on the dollar. And the reason why employers get away with it is because women accept it. And we shouldn't accept it. And unfortunately, sometimes it takes litigation to change that. But I think actually the more effective means is public protest, public shaming, public exposure, and women mobilizing and learning how to negotiate and learning how to not accept lower salaries, and more importantly, transparency. One of the reasons why women also get paid less is because they don't know they're getting paid less. And private companies are not required to make it public what everyone's salaries are. And public employers do. So that's another strategy that lawyers who are focused on gender pay equity, they will try to figure out ways to make it more public. Because then once women realize that the man that's sitting next to them, and in many cases is junior to them, to defend their own rights and speak up and ask for more money, or move and get another job where they get paid what they're worth. Okay, so then I also worked for the Department of Homeland Security at the Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, and that was a great opportunity to see how one can work within the federal government to try to defend civil rights and civil liberties through policy changes. Because when you do litigation, you are representing usually individuals. And so most cases, it's one of the downsides of our legal system, our civil rights legal system and anti-discrimination laws is it's individually focused, not systemically focused. Class actions, for example, are for systemic changes. However, thanks to very strong and powerful lobbyists that represent corporations and companies and wealthy entities that tend to be sued for civil rights violations, those lobbyists have successfully changed the law and litigated cases to the Supreme Court, which has ruled in very conservative ways against class actions, right? So when you go to court, you tend to be limited to the particular individual that you represent. And so you're not necessarily changing the system, you're just getting that particular individual relief for a violation of a law, but the law and everything surrounding that law and the policies and practices don't necessarily change at a systemic level. And that's one of the big challenges that social justice lawyers face, is thinking, how can we change the system rather than simply remedy one person at a time, but the system's not changing, so there just continues to be this endless line of victims. So even if you're able to stop someone from being evicted, if the system is structured to produce more evictions, especially of minorities or women or single mothers or poor people, you haven't really made anything better. You've helped one person, but that's not, there will be so many others that will suffer. And so that's kind of one of the frames that we always try to look through to figure out how can the laws be more systemic, right, in fixing or in stopping the types of injustices that we identify. And then after I practiced law, and I also represented Muslim organizations in Washington, D.C. against post 9/11 discrimination and just various advocacy work, then I decided to come into the academy. And that's where I have focused most of my efforts now on what we call the production of knowledge, right? Which is to take what we see in the world and we theorize it, we critique it, we call for reforms, we examine the disparity or the difference between how the law is supposed to act, or what the law is supposed to do and what the law actually does, which is often not the same, because something can be facially neutral or appear facially on the books to not be discriminatory, but based on the political and social environment and the way that it's actually enforced or not enforced, then you start to see the discriminatory effects. And then of course the hard part, so that's one part, and then the harder part is how do you fix it? And that really takes a very concerted collective effort by all of us, right? So then after that, so this is how I ended up at Rutgers Law School. I was at Texas A&M, and then I came to Rutgers Law School, and I love teaching. I have wonderful fellows in my center and wonderful students that I teach, and I hope one day some of you will be my students, because I definitely try to train my students to be tough and to be smart and to be competent. And so this is where I want to turn a little bit to, I want to speak to my fellow, to all of you, the woke generation. Yeah, I'm really excited that we have a woke generation, but I do have some advice for you. And that is that being woke is not the same as being knowledgeable and being skillful. And what you want to do is you want to keep that wokeness, you want to keep that passion and that fire in the belly, but it's not enough, because you will get outsmarted, you will get outmaneuvered, you will get outskilled if all you have is raw wokeness. So you have to go out there and do your homework. You got to study and learn, get the facts, get the skills, learn the craft, understand the game so that you can either change it, defeat it, destroy it, replace it, right? Depending on the circumstances. But you can't just go in there and shout and scream, and that's just not gonna win the day. And so I think it's really important for your generation to combine the passion, right, with the work and the knowledge. And that does take time, and it takes years. But you don't do it in time. You just kind of figure out what it is you can do to act on your wokeness while you're developing your skills and your knowledge. And you're here today, so clearly you are willing to put in the time, right, to learn. So then after that, so I guess that's how I got to where I am. And I encourage you all, if you're interested in reading my work, to go to ssrn.com. So it stands for Social Science Research Network, and Google my name, search my name. You'll find all my articles. They're free for download, or you can go to academia.edu. And much of my work is focused on the intersection of civil rights and national security. I also work a lot on rule of law, human rights, and authoritarianism in Egypt, in large part because I was very vested in the revolution of 2011 as a member of the Egyptian diaspora. And so I did a lot of research on why it failed ultimately, unfortunately. And I will tell you all, as Americans or people who live in America, and if you are a citizen, make sure that you have registered to vote if you're of age, and that you vote in every single election, including your school board, including your city, including your state elections, because the people who are running for office actually pay attention to that. They look at the numbers and they look at the names, and they will, you do matter, even though you don't know that, but all that information is being relayed to candidates, and they'll know that, look at all these women who are voting, right? They're clearly vested. We need to make sure that we don't have policies that are clearly anti-women, because they're voting, they're showing up to the polls. So, but all that is to say that you should think about being an attorney for various reasons. So in addition to obviously making sure that your voice is heard. So first is, if you care about social justice issues like voting rights, or if you care about reproductive justice, employment fairness, housing rights, education rights, anti-Black racism, anti-xenophobia, immigrant rights, all of these, climate change, all of these social justice issues are embedded in law. Law is a factor, a component that is involved in every aspect of our society. Now, of course, there are other areas such as public health and such as engineering and sciences and scientific research, but the law is always one of the components in any kind of social justice issue. And the person who knows the law has a huge informational advantage in figuring out how to change the law, right? In figuring out what the strategies are. And that's also connected to political mobilization. So it's not just about being in the courtroom, but it's also about being in the streets. It's about being in online activism, in school activism, in community activism, because alone you are very weak, you know, as one or two or three individuals, but as a group, you're much more powerful. And those who are in power, they want to stay in power and don't want their power challenged. What they want is for you to be complacent, for you to be lazy, for you not to care, to be apathetic, or to talk but don't show up, to talk but not do the work, because that keeps them in power. But when you're an engaged citizen and you're willing to do that work, you're willing to take that time, then suddenly they can't just do whatever they want. Right? They are going to be held accountable. And a lot of the ills in society and a lot of the social justice problems we have is because people in power are not being held accountable. They're not doing their jobs the way they're supposed to do it. Or they're beholden to one special interest group or another, and those special interest groups tend to be wealthy. and powerful themselves. So they keep the system going to serve the wealthy and the powerful. So you have the power to change that, but you have to work as a group, you have to collaborate, you have to cooperate, which brings me to another point that's really important, particularly as women. We have to support each other. I mean, we can disagree with each other, and we can certainly, sometimes we're on the other side of issues or in opposing counsel if you're in a litigation case, but we don't want to fall for the trap of what I call the patriarchal female, because patriarchy cannot exist. It cannot operate. It cannot survive without female foot soldiers. And oftentimes they don't even realize that they're the female foot soldiers of patriarchy. So if you think of the most kind of stereotypical scenario where a woman is told you should behave and you should be good and you should listen and you should dress this way and you should act this way and you should talk this way, and it's all based on gender stereotypes, oftentimes it's women telling them that, even though those rules are set by men, and they're rules set to accommodate men's desires and men's power and men's frame of reference and their experiences. But it's often the women that are actually the implementers. So I think I've taken up enough time. I don't want to go over the half-hour mark because I want to make sure that I have enough time to answer your questions. And so I will end here, and I look forward to engaging with you all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Aziz. That was wonderful and completely inspirational, and I'm really moved by it, especially since I do want to go in law, and probably many other women here do too. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, or if you would like to say it, use the raise hand feature, and we will just call on you.
We have a question from Lillian. You can unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor Aziz, for your discussion today, and thank you to the wonderful women in this group who hosted this. I'm going to be applying to Rutgers University this year, specifically to the Camden location. That's just as a FYI. And I am going to be entering law school, hopefully at Rutgers as a non-traditional student. I've been in the tech industry as a woman of color for over 10 years. And Professor Aziz, you touched on two things, and I would love to hear your feedback on. One was women being paid about 20, I believe you mentioned 20 cents less than men on the dollar on average, and women sticking together. And that's an interesting topic that you bring up, because as a woman in the tech industry, in the corporate world, one of the first things I did was join one of these women in affinity groups where, you know, as the organization or the company, the women get together and we encourage women, we push women, each other, to climb the corporate ladder. And one thing I suggested to the group, which I thought was interesting, I said, hey, all of these yoga sessions and these wine events, things like this, what are we doing to empower women to make sure we're all being paid the same? None of the women really supported that. The phone was completely quiet. It was a conference line. I really felt like the black sheep. I didn't get any support, say anything, because they didn't want to, I guess, rumble things in the corporate environment. And I guess what I was saying was that I didn't realize it was that rumbling. I thought it was, disturbing that we're underpaid. And I thought for sure I would have the support of other women who doesn't want to be paid the same amount as men. These wine events and these yoga events and these outings are great, but I want to be paid what a man is being paid. And there was so much lack of support just from other women that it really didn't go anywhere.
Let me tell you, this is first, I think you're exactly the person that should be a lawyer. This was my experience before I became a lawyer. I did exactly the same thing. And then I realized, what's going on here? Why am I the only one? So the first thing I experienced, and my friends told me, they said, you need to go be a lawyer because that's what you should do. So I'm glad that you're going to go to law school, and I do hope that you join us at Rutgers. So so let's just kind of frame that a little bit.
Yeah.
One of the challenges of dealing with injustice or equality and equity is not imposing the burden on the oppressed. And yet at the same time, it's usually oppressed or the subordinated, which is a term of art in critical race theory, who have the most to lose and therefore are the ones who are most likely to fight the fight for a long time because they're the ones who are vested in it, right? In other words, much of this anti-Black racism movement and Black Lives Matter, look, you probably are already seeing a lot of white liberals or non-Black liberals who are not, that's not what they're chanting anymore, because it's not their Black sons whose lives are being risked when they go out and wear a hoodie. It's not their Black husbands and their Black brothers or Black women as well who are victimized by police brutality. And so oftentimes those who aren't members of the oppressed are the ones who are quickest to give up, are quickest to move on and say, oh, I'm going to focus on another issue. So realistically, it is going to be those who are harmed the most that are going to fight the long fight. But at the same time, by definition, the reason why they're harmed, the reason why they're discriminated is because they're not powerful, is because they are the relatively less powerful or powerless, they are relatively powerless. And that's why it's so easy to discriminate against them. And so that's the paradox we try to figure out. So that one, and that's why they say you have to have allies, you have to have people from the more powerful group. But again, members of that group are more likely not to stick with it because change takes a long time. It takes generations. Now, so that's where you get into the internal versus external pressures. So what we've learned is it's not going to be an effective strategy in the long run to expect, for example, women employees to be the leaders of pay equity within the company because their job security is on the line and they have families, they have bills, they have, you know, it's not, the cost is extremely high and employers know that and they exploit it. Because it's one thing to say, well, worst case scenario, if I upset the people that I'm criticizing, they'll be mad at me. Well, that's not a big price to pay. But if the price is I will now be unemployed, which leads to poverty, which leads to eviction, which leads to, and I could be blackballed in the industry, then you realize that is not a feasible strategy. It's got to be a different strategy, right? And so that's where you start thinking about things like public pressure. That's where you have stakeholder advocacy now. It's the stakeholders. So you use nonprofit organizations and civil society who then go and look for different stakeholders that can pressure companies, whether it's a specific company or whether it's an industry. And then the change comes from outside and then the beneficiaries are on the inside. So for example, you have the shareholder advocacy. You also have clients who will say, in law firms, this is starting to happen, which is one of the reasons why retention of minorities and retention of women is slowly starting to increase, where clients will tell a law firm that they hire them for a big case and that case requires 10 lawyers. And they will put in the contract that the litigation team needs to have X percentage or at least one, or sometimes it's detailed, sometimes it's more generic, but there must be minority lawyers on the team, or there must be a minority partner, or they must be a woman partner. And if you don't have that, we're going somewhere else. Well, that's quite an incentive. And lo and behold, suddenly their message changes from, well, we just can't find any qualified candidates. We just can't find any qualified minorities or qualified women, to, oh, we found qualified women who want to do it, or qualified minorities who want these jobs. So that has worked. Public shaming, right? Public advocacy campaigns that embarrass, and obviously you need to have the facts, and you have to be very careful not to engage in defamation. And defamation is when you perpetuate or state incorrect information that's false, that then has a defamatory effect. But if it's true, let the facts speak for themselves. So all that is to tell you that oftentimes these affinity groups are public relations stunts to try to tell external actors, look at what we're doing. Now, that doesn't mean that affinity groups don't have other benefits like camaraderie, like community, like creating safe spaces, but You are correct. That is not an effective means for that type of reform. Okay, there are different ways that you can reform it, but those employees are too vulnerable. And the company is very savvy at figuring out ways to either marginalize or fire women who will demand and cause trouble. And usually they're smart enough to do it in a way that doesn't provide evidence that it's based on gender. And if they're not that smart, that could complain about gender pay disparity, and maybe she wins her case, but she gets relief, and yet the system doesn't change. They continue less than what they should be paid. But again, these are all things we teach you in law school.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be applying to Rutgers. It's exactly for these kinds of conversations. As you can imagine, as a woman in the tech industry, this is not something we talk about in our cubicle huddles, right? Pre-COVID. So thank you so much for your answer. And thank you so much for hosting the session.
Yeah, I'd like to first apologize if I mispronounce anybody's name, but Craig asked, what kind of responsibilities do you want to see your male coworkers undertake?
I want them to stop being cowards. I'm really disappointed in men. I know I'm stereotyping, because they don't, not all men, I shouldn't say that. There's a couple of issues. The first thing is that men need to understand that when women are underpaid, they are harmed too. Because there's different, Derek Bell, who is a critical race theorist, he's kind of the father, one of the fathers of critical race theory. There's some fathers and mothers of critical race theory. But Derek Bell, African-American professor, he was at Harvard, and then he quit and left a tenured position at Harvard because they refused to hire a Black woman in the law faculty. They had never had a Black woman law professor, and they kept making up excuses that there were no qualified women. And he was so committed to the, and started teaching law at NYU Law. And he talks about something called the convergence of interest, where you're not going to get members of privileged groups to help underprivileged groups unless they have an interest in it too. And so it's a very kind of realistic, realpolitik approach rather than, oh, they'll do it out of the kindness of their heart. He was somewhat of a skeptic about the kindness of their heart argument. And in fact, if you look at the civil rights movement in 1964, there were a lot of external factors that caused, I mean, some of it was also external, such that, for example, the communists during the Cold War were using racism against Blacks and abuse against Blacks and all of the, the use of the water hoses and the dogs and the beatings that was being shown on television to tell third world countries that America was evil, that America was racist, that America hated non-white people, and therefore you all should join us. You should be a member of the Communist Party. You should be allied with the Soviet Union. Well, that was a really big problem for the American government, which was primarily white. And so suddenly it was actually in the United States international interests, AKA the predominantly white government's national interest, to stop being so overtly racist against Blacks. And that was one of the factors that pushed forward the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It wasn't the only one, but that was that was a major factor that isn't discussed a lot in our discussions about the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So I'm just mentioning that to say that women, there's many arguments you can make with regard to your male colleagues. So the first one is, if you're going to be in a heterosexual marriage or have a heterosexual relationship and have children, okay, when women are paid less, your family, whether you're married or not, and your children are being robbed of money, right? It's not a zero-sum game. It's not that you get paid less. It's that they need to get paid more and equalize the pay scales. That's a convergence of interest issue. And you have daughters. And when you allow that system to continue, you've now guaranteed that your no matter how much you invest in their education and you invest in them in becoming leaders and being successful in school, and everything you do for your daughters, they're going to go out there and they're only going to make 80 cents on the dollar. Is that really what you want? Is that the type of world that you want your daughter to enter into? You have a responsibility to make the world better for your daughter. So that's also an argument to be made. And that is the responsibility of the father. It's not the responsibility just of the mother. And then the third thing is, men need to understand that you have male privilege, even if you're a minority man, right? So when we talk about intersectionality, there are different identities, right? So I have class privilege, absolutely. When I walk into a room and show them my business card that I'm a Rutgers law professor, that boosts my class status in ways that if I was next to an Arab Muslim woman who was not a professor, in many regards, even though we could be identical in all other ways, from our immigrant status to the way we look to our ethnic origin. And so if I'm in a situation and I have class status, right, I have class privilege, I have a responsibility to speak out, because I know that when I speak out, disrespected because she doesn't have the class privilege. Okay, so the more privilege you have, the more responsibility you have to reform. And so men, you have male privilege. It's much more powerful when men mobilize and tell male executives that it's unacceptable to pay women 80 cents on the dollar. Now, are they going to do that? Probably not. You know why? Because it's not their paycheck that's affected. And because taking money from them. And that's not the case. Okay. Trust me, these corporations have plenty of profit. And in fact, anyway, we can go into kind of the economics of it, but that's not the way that it should be framed, as a zero-sum game that either I get it or you get it, and then we're competing with each other. And so that's something that I think men should do, but they're not doing, and they haven't done. And I don't think they ever will, because there's no convergence of interest unless they can see it as part of their problem for their daughters, for their wives, for their life partners, for their sisters, for their mothers, something that's personal to them. I'm not optimistic, but your generation, I hope you prove me wrong. I want you to prove me wrong.
Okay, so I'll take 2 more questions. Raheem has your hand up. So.
All right, thank you so much. Could everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I'm so sorry I have my camera off. I can't turn it on right now, but Professor Aziz, I just wanted to say thank you so much. I really appreciate everything that you shared. Like, seeing everything on a different perspective, I think that's really revolutionary. I've had a lot of experience after graduating from Rutgers, working in different corporate roles, and I've definitely seen and witnessed a whole lot of gender inequality. A lot of these corporations, what they do is not justifiable to share your salary. So how could men speak up about that when it's kind of against corporate policy to share your policy? How do you avoid putting yourself at risk, your family at risk, your overall professionalism at risk, but still help in this movement?
Right. And that is exactly what that rule is very purposeful, right? That you could be fired for that, for disclosing salaries, because they know the natives will revolt. It's a very colonialist mentality. And this is evidence of just how malicious this pay equity issue, inequality is. It's intentional. It's not even accidental, because they don't want you to share the salaries. So this is where you have to start looking at those external factors, right? And if you wanted to do it through laws, and there has been legislation, it hasn't succeeded, but that doesn't mean you don't keep trying, right? Where there is more transparency, where there's mandated transparency in salaries for private sector. Again, that's one strategy. The other is that if there is when there's litigation, people can be deposed. Now, again, that only solves one particular person's problem. The other is to try to, and this is where, I mean, this is hard to control, but this is just more of a generational issue. But what we really need is a different type of corporate leaders, right? We need corporate leaders, whether they're men or women, whose philosophy, right, even in the capitalist system, is that pay equity, gender pay equity is good for business. You've got to make it good for business. And that's where the bad publicity, if it's bad for business, they change it. But also that rather than sued and publicly pressured, but that they do it because they understand that this is what retains people. Because every time you get new employees, you have to train them. And then if they leave, you got to retrain. It's actually quite expensive to have high attrition. So that's one. The other strategy is, and this is something we've been trying to do in law schools, although I don't think we're doing a good enough job, but there have been discussions about this among female law professors in particular, is training and preparing our, for example, female law students on how to negotiate their salaries, because there are many different reasons why women don't get paid equal pay. And one reason is that they don't ask. They just accept what they get. Because they are socialized to think that that's greedy, that that's wrong, that that's bad character, right? It's professional, it's a transaction, it's not personal. And lo and behold, when you ask for more, sometimes you actually get it. Now, I will tell you, because when I had this discussion with my colleagues, they did warn me that there are studies that show that in some cases, women are actually punished for asking for more because people are socialized to think, what, are you not grateful for what you have? But I still think that women should still, especially when they're being hired, I think when you work in the company, you don't have as much leverage. But when you're being hired, you do have. You can negotiate full job salary, not based on that particular company's salary structure. So if you were already underpaid at your former job and then you go to a new job and you get a whole career, you're unpaid compared to your peers at that particular company. So also when you move jobs, you need to figure out a way to look at what the market rate is and not even and try to take the discussion away from what you were paid at your old job and not even talk about that if you can, just avoid it. Because 9 times out of 10, you're underpaid at your current job if you're a woman. So if you then look at the market rate, which you can do research on and say, this is the market rate for this skill set for this position, and this is what I want. And try not to even let them know what your past salary is. So there are different strategies that can be used, but this is definitely a societal problem that has to be fixed by the society. So, and I will tell you, even if you can't do anything within your profession, within your company, even speaking to women and recognizing that there's gender pay inequality means a lot to those women. And then figuring out how you can work with civil society groups, even if it's volunteer time or you donate money. There are many nonprofits who focus exclusively on pay equity issues. Even just supporting them through financial donations is being part of the solution. But putting your head in the sand, which is what most men do, and pretending like it's not a big deal is just it's very sexist, period.
Thank you, Professor.
Okay, so our last question is from Sadie. As many of us on this call are teens of Generation Z, how would you advise us to avoid the trap of wokeness and avoid dispassionate activism?
Oh, you got to read a lot, and you need to. So it's a challenge. So the first thing you want to do is there's a saying that says it's not about how much you read, it's what you read, right? It's so you need to identify the experts and the scholars and the advocates, and and experts don't have to be people with degrees, right? They can be the lifelong in the trenches activists who may not even have finished high school, but they know their stuff based on life experience. So first you need to identify the people that you respect in terms of their worldview, in terms of their values, in terms of their wokeness, so that when you do read their work and when you go to learn from them, or you listen to them, or you watch them, you are not being led astray. You're not essentially being deprogrammed to not be woke, to be complacent and to accept the status quo. And oftentimes those people are not going to necessarily be in your public schools, because unfortunately public schools are also part of the system, and there are a lot of people with power who don't want students to be exposed to certain ideas, right? And this is how social media has been so revolutionary, is that it has allowed people, both K through 12 students, but also people that are in college or past college, to be able to access information that wasn't otherwise available to them through traditional means, that wasn't being curated by mainstream media. And so the gatekeepers of information and the gatekeepers of knowledge no longer have as much power as they do. So for example, somebody like me will not ever get invited to speak on CNN, because CNN, for example, is a very mainstream media source, and those media sources have sponsors and they have board members, and that entire structure is based on the status quo, and that has to do with power and wealth. And so if you're the person who's going to go and say things that challenges that, and especially if you're not the right demographic, and that's one of the reasons why you don't see a lot of people of color. I mean, how many of you have actually seen Arabs and Muslims on mainstream television talk about the Middle East, talk about Islam, talk about post 9/11 discrimination, talk about terrorism? Very few, even though we're the ones that are most affected, and there's plenty of us that are experts on these topics. And so there's also, so that's part of the system. So find the people that you respect and that have expertise, demonstrated expertise. They're not just a bunch of loudmouths, but you can prove that they actually know based on years of experience, based on publications, based on things that objective criteria. And then you've got to dig in and you've got to do your own homework and think for yourself. And that requires a lot of work, because one of the temptations is to kind of have the coffee shop, well, it's now virtual, is to sit around and talk a lot and talk a lot and talk a lot and complain a lot and complain a lot. But what's your plan? What's your strategy? Are you thinking big picture? Are you thinking long term? Are you being forward thinking and strategic, or are you being reactionary and defensive? Right? So also where you go to school, you should be very specific. In particular, you guys pay a lot of money, you're going to be in an enormous amount of debt, right? As students in college, go and do some research and find out who those professors are and how you're going to make sure that you get an education that exposes you to critical thinking and exposes you to different ideas and lets you work through that and gives you the types of experiences on the campus that expose you to people of different races and ethnicities and classes, socioeconomics. If you're upper middle class or middle class, you've probably had very little interaction with low-income people, because we're highly segregated as a society along class. Similarly, you're probably, if you're upper middle class or middle class, you're probably in a predominantly white school district, even if you yourself aren't white, which means you don't have a lot of experience with minorities, because and also you don't have a lot of experience with minorities who are low income, because the disproportionate number of people who are low income are Black and brown by design. It's not an accident, right? And so you need to find places where you want that. And when you tell colleges that's what you're looking for, they listen, because at the end of the day, the universities need to fill those seats. They need the tuition revenue. They need the students. So that's one way that you as students or potential students can influence universities. And then that has a domino effect, right? So, so I don't have like a silver, I don't have a magic pill. It takes a lot of work. I will leave you with one piece of advice. Pick 2 issues that you care very deeply about and commit your life to it. That's it. Don't do more than 2. You can't. And what I mean by commit your life, I mean, it doesn't have to mean that you're going to major in that. It doesn't mean that you're going to do, that's your professional job, but it means that you're going to care about it for the rest of your life. And the way that you act on that concern for those issues is volunteering, perhaps what you major in, perhaps what you take, what careers you pursue, perhaps, or just donating money when you have the money. Right now you have the time. You probably don't have the money because you're still young, but later you're not going to have a lot of time because you have more responsibilities, but you will have more money. And so you can donate to the people who have committed their careers. And you have to decide what those 2 issues are. And don't be scatterbrained and be like, oh, I got 10 issues I care about. That doesn't mean you don't care about those other issues, right? It doesn't mean you don't read about them, but you need to have 2 issues because what we need is lifelong fighters. We need lifelong committed advocates, because when you lose interest, that's when the cause doesn't move forward. Voting rights. Oh, I care about it for a year. Okay, now I don't care about voting rights. Well, who's going to stick to voting rights? You know what Stacey Abrams did was one of her lifelong commitments. The way she changed, she and her team, she wasn't alone. She had a team of people, but she had a vision. That took decades. She was an activist since she was in high school. And she just kept at it and kept at it. And every time she would learn new strategies. And as you develop, as you engage, you will become a more sophisticated strategic thinker. But you've got to stay in the game. So you have to figure out, well, I know what my 2 issues are, but you got to find what your 2 issues are.
Professor Aziz, I want to personally thank you on behalf of myself and the entire co-founding team of YCACW. It's truly been an honor hearing from you today, and I can confidently say that all of the advice and knowledge that you've spread upon us is not only inspirational to people that are interested in pursuing law, but also just teens on this call, and anybody who can hear you speak can definitely pull such relevant information out. So thank you so much for spending your time with us today and for imparting all this information on us. And with that, I also want to say that if you haven't already checked out Professor Aziz's Twitter and Instagram account, you really should. She definitely has an incredible group of people that she's working with. And you should really give that a check out. And also please check out our Instagram. It's at YCAC Women's Leadership. I put the link in the chat below, and I will do so again. And please consider donating to our organization so that we can host more events like this and have more speakers and hear what you guys would like to have us have events on. And with that, I really want to just thank you again. And I hope that you all enjoy this event as much as we did.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I hope to see many of you at Rutgers. All right, take care.
That's awesome.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Oh,
Yay!
she just left. Okay.
Wait, Sadie, it's still recording.
Oh.